Everyone, welcome back. Today I want to take a look at the development of Mannerism to Baroque art as we begin our discussion of the 17th century. I wanted to pick up where we left off with our discussion of art with Mannerism. And one of the main Mannerist works that we were examining was the Last Judgment by Michelangelo, as he is paid to later come back to the Sistine Chapel. This time he's going to be painting the wall behind the altar. The image is going to be very different from that of the ceiling. The ceiling celebrating life, celebrating humans as the center of God's creation, having that free will to choose to reach towards God. What we see is this, the centerpiece of the Last Judgment is God coming back, raising his hand to cast the sinners down to hell. And it's a very different kind of mood, a very different kind of sentiment that's being represented. And what we see is that there's been a lot that's happened politically and religiously over the last couple of decades that changes drastically Michelangelo's representation and what we would consider the first real Mannerist work of art. And so what we see here is a transition between the Renaissance simplicity, ideals, the focus on Neoplatonism and humanism, all beginning to change as Italy is constantly invaded and is now being torn apart by wars, and also now you have religion being torn apart. There's a lot more anxiety. There's a lot more tension, a lot more uncertainty. And so one of the major elements that we talked about last time was the Counter-Reformation, and this is the Catholic Church's response to the growing tide of dissent that's happening in the North with Martin Luther and John Calvin, and also with Henry VIII. We see that the Catholic Church is now wanting to preserve its superiority and reassert its dominance and authority. And so with the Council of Trent, they meet together and they suggest that as they're, forbidding, they come together and develop a list of banned books, and Calvin and Luther were on the top of the list. But they also developed the Jesuits, which was the missionary wing of the Catholic Church going out to spread the message of the gospel, trying to what they would consider, quote unquote, correct false beliefs, but also bring missions and developments in Africa and South America to be able to bring people who they consider to be, quote unquote, uncivilized into the message of the gospel. And so the message of Catholicism was always this idea of Christendom, to unite the world under one faith. But it also has this constant this heavy influence within the arts. And what they suggest is that art should convey a Catholic message. It should display the power, wealth, and grandeur of the church. And so any art that's coming after this time in 1545, and there's another meeting in 1563, any art that comes after this is going to strongly be influenced by this idea, right? Where in the North, what we see is moving away from saints and Mary and very Catholic messages to focus more on daily life. What we see within Italy, and the countries that are still Catholic, is a very Catholic message. And so what we see with Michelangelo's here is he has Christ coming back to cast all the sinners down to hell, which you can only imagine, right? Martin Luther writes the 95 Theses in 1517, and Michelangelo comes back in 1534. So it's about, what would that be? It's not quite 20 years later. But what we see here is that Michelangelo and the Catholic Church is, their message here is all those sinners who are moving away from the Catholic Church. This is what's going to happen to you. And so this was a kind of not only a message of Christianity, but more specifically, it was also propaganda to some extent for the Catholic Church to say, this is what's going to happen to those who move away from us, and this is where our authority is. And so I wanted to juxtapose these two images, one by Bruegel, we've taken a look at this one before, what's happening in the north, and Michelangelo's The Last Judgment, which is happening in Italy, roughly about the same time. I mean, I guess this is, there's about 30 years difference between them, but they demonstrate the same they demonstrate the ideals, one happening in the north and one happening in Italy, between what's happening in art, right? What we have in the north with Martin Luther is people are moving away from these images that they consider to be graven, right? If you have an image of Mary that you carry around your neck, or a cross, or something that you're praying to, they consider that to be a graven image. And as it says in the Ten Commandments, right, you shouldn't have that faith in graven images. You shouldn't have false gods. And so they believe that these images are becoming false gods, even though the Catholic Church sees these images as a way for people to reflect on and to get closer to God, as a way of immersing within the kind of feeling the Spirit. It's kind of like singing a hymn or something of that nature. With the Reformation, they don't see it that way. They see it more as these things are becoming in the way of people's individual relationship with God. And so we see very different images, very different art emerging in each era that reflects their time. It reflects their values. And so where Michelangelo's image here is focusing mainly on Christ and Mary coming back, Bruegel's The Tower of Babel doesn't necessarily have any overt images to it, but it has both of them have very similar messages, right? Both of them are about the folly of humanity. Both of them are about how we need to stay on the right course. Here in Michelangelo's image, though, the right course is the Catholic Church. In the north, the right course is, reading the Bible, doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? So we see very different values, even though they have the same kind of message. Very different ways of going about that reflect the era in which they were created. And so so we see, some of the major influences and how art reflects its era. I want to take a look at another Mannerist painter known as El Greco. That was a nickname of him because he came from Greece. And so they just called him the Greek. He came from Greece and traveled to Italy in 1568 and later to Rome in 1570. And mainly he worked with other artists like Titian and Giorgio Vasari. Some people speculate that he was disliked, or he had a struggling relationship among these artists. One rumor said that he disliked or criticized Michelangelo's Last Judgment, and because of that, he left to Spain and remained there for the rest of his life. I don't know if that story is true or not. I mean, I guess it would suggest don't criticize Michelangelo. I guess that's kind of the lesson to be learned here. But mainly his works show a Mannerist style. You can see the emphasis of the Council of Trent in his works and how different his images are from the north, where we see with the disrobing of Christ. Here we see Christ's robes being, as he's getting ready to be crucified, his robes are being kind of stripped away from him in the mob. But then it's kind of interesting. So you have kind of Christ here in this kind of ancient garb here with a robe. But then you have someone that's wearing contemporary armor as a kind of a Roman soldier. But the Roman soldier here is wearing what they would wear in the 16th century. And so El Greco brings this biblical image into the contemporary world to get us to think about where our relationship is with God, and are we causing further kind of problems within the Catholic Church, which is a very kind of different message than we see within the North. Here we see Albrecht Dürer's self-portrait, where he's portraying himself to be like Christ, suggesting that it's important to him, to emulate Christ. And so again, both of them have very similar messages, getting us to think about our individual relationship with Christ and where we are, but they have a different way of going about it, One is really focusing on these overt biblical kind of images. Another one is focusing more on a secular type of image and transcending that secular image into something more kind of religious or more spiritual in that regard. And we see this, time and time again here with El Greco's The Holy Trinity. What we see within this particular one is more of his elongated forms, rather than, focusing on the Renaissance where everything's kind of balanced and harmonious and mathematically precise and anatomically correct. The main focus for Mannerism was on twisted and contorted forms that were elongated, that were exaggerated to show more emotion. But again, focusing more on very overt Christian Catholic messages. And so here we see the Holy Trinity of God the Father here, who is portrayed to be wearing the Pope's clothing. So there's an obvious Catholic message there. And then the Holy Ghost that's over their head. So you see the three in one, and they're surrounded by angels, as opposed to Bruegel's The Beggars, which is just these individuals who have some type of physical disability that they have then kind of thrown off into the world to kind of fend for themselves. But again, the question here is, what is our responsibility to them, right? Do we have a responsibility to help people who are in need? Do we have a responsibility to help the poor, as Christ has, counseled us to do again and again? And so even though there's no real overt message here, this is not, about celebrating Martin Luther or celebrating a saint. This is just a secular image. And so there's a similar kind of message, but they just have a very different approach to them. And similar images that we see here. Another El Greco image, Christ carrying the cross, very Catholic, focusing on Christ, focusing on the cross, focusing on the Catholic message. Or we see Hans Holbein's Henry VIII, focusing on more of the secular realm. And again, what they're seeking to do as they focus on that secular realm is to find ways, if we can understand ourselves a little bit better, maybe we can kind of elevate ourselves to become better, right? So introspection, this idea of mysticism, which we talked about before, is central to their ideas, that it's about our individual relationship, each person's individual relationship with God, not necessarily about our relationship with saints or our relationship with the Pope. It's about us and connecting with God. So again, just get a sense of that juxtaposition between the northern art, what's happening, and what's happening within Italy. This is the last image I want to show you of El Greco and the Mannerist style. But mainly what we see within El Greco is the burial of Count Orgaz, is we see the stylistic blending of the visible and the invisible, right? The heavenly world surrounds us unbeknownst to us, right? And so here we see that the heavenly world of Christ and Mother Mary, and then saints praying towards Christ, and then this angel. They're all right above head, really close to the people here who are below in this earthly kind of setting. And then the Pope kind of holds this individual up, and as he's getting ready to be buried I guess just getting ready to be buried. But what we see here is that both of them he juxtaposes this idea of this burial, emphasizing Pope, emphasizing ceremonies, as the Council of Trent suggests, and then emphasizing the power of the Catholic Church, right, with the Pope here, and then the emphasis, the emphasis of St. Peter having the keys, always focusing back to the authority of the Catholic Church and how everyone else must therefore be wrong. Whereas with Bruegel's, the wedding feast is just a secular image, right? It is kind of a sacrament, it's kind of a celebration, but here it's not necessarily done within a church. This is just done in some other. It looks like a stake center, no, but it's just done in another building, right? And it's just the emphasis on day-to-day life, and that's what we see again and again within the North, which is very different from what we see in Italy, some of the major stylistic differences. What's going to unite these two styles, though, to unite these two eras, is the Baroque art. And I want to take a look at Baroque. And Baroque is a term that comes after the era, as generally things are within the art world and art history and the humanities. As art historians and scholars go back to take a look at a particular era, they start saying, well, there's a lot of things that are happening very similarly here. Let's see if we can categorize it. And so they kind of came back afterwards, and they called this type of art Baroque art. And Baroque is Portuguese for an irregular pearl. And so it's something that has value, but it just looks a little bit different. And so whether you agree with that as a demarcation or not, this is the kind of the moniker that establishes this art of the 1600s to about 1700s. This mainly becomes the driving force of the art. And you're going to see some of the major developments that are happening. They're going to have some stylistic commonalities to them. One is going to be, there's going to be more dynamic movement, focusing on motion, capturing motion within the work. In order to capture more emotion, they're going to focus on more motion. It's going to have more complex compositions. This is all going to be very different from the Renaissance. It's going to focus on the climax of the story, right? So whatever story is being represented, they're going to focus on the highest moment of intensity. They're going to focus on emotions. The emotions, rather than the restrained, refined emotions of the Renaissance, is going to be more extreme happiness, extreme kind of suffering. You're going to see tenebrism, which we're going to take a look at, or it's also known as chiaroscuro, light and dark. Chiaroscuro is Italian for light and dark. You're going to see, in painting, you're going to see a shortened background. Rather than focusing on, this never-ending linear perspective, they're going to shorten the background. I'll talk a little bit about that. And it's going to feel like more of a snapshot, or you guys might be a little bit young for this, but a Polaroid, right? So it's just kind of a quick kind of moment, making it feel more realistic, as though things are happening, rather than the Renaissance, which is focusing more on the contrapposto stance, where you have more weight given to one foot than another, making it seem as though it's static and trying to bring back the style of ancient Greece and Rome. This is going to be more of a snapshot. And one of the best images I can think of for this that kind of represents this era is Bernini's David. And what we see here is Bernini's David here getting ready. He has the sling in his hand, and he is in full motion, getting ready to he has the rock and the sling. He's going to fling it over his head as fast as he can and then throw the rock. And so this is a David in motion. I have a couple of images that I took when I went to this one. This one's currently in the Borghese, which is a museum in Rome of a very wealthy family, the Borgheses, and they have quite a bit of art in their gallery that they've now opened up to the public. But you can see that this is David of motion. You see the stern look on his face. You can see the rock in one hand, and he's getting ready to take that up, and he's going to sling. And at his feet, you will see the armor that was too big for him, and so it's just kind of laying there at his feet. And then the harp, as he's associated with music and psalms. And this is just a couple other kind of shots to show, but or a couple other images that I wanted to show you. But mainly what we see with this emphasis of the Baroque era is on this diagonal movement. Rather than focusing on the vertical or the horizontal plane, which we see a lot in the Renaissance, this is more on the diagonals, the diagonal movement of the arms and the legs kind of spread as he's, digging into the earth and getting ready to fling. And what I want you to think about as we think about the Baroque era is how it's different from the Renaissance. And so I want you to compare and contrast Bernini's David versus Michelangelo's David, right? To see the different values that's being emphasized within these two works of art. And so as we take a look at them, we can see that there's that Michelangelo's is focusing more on that vertical axis, where we see Bernini's is focusing more on the diagonal lines of the legs and the arms. We see that this is the David that's going off in the battlefield, staring down his opponent, this rock in one hand, the sling in another, as he's getting ready. This is the David of contemplation. This is the David, Bernini's David is the David of motion and the David of action. Very different kind of feelings, different kind of moods that's being evoked between them. I want to take a look at another Bernini image. This one is known as the abduction of let's see if I can find it, abduction of Persephone. And what happens within this one, this was an ancient Greek myth where Hades was all alone down in Hades, right, which was the underworld where all the dead go. All alone, didn't have anyone to look after him, help him, have a companionship. And so he goes to Zeus, his brother, and says, look, I'm all down alone, dealing with the dead all day. I need someone. And so Zeus gives him one of his many daughters. He gives him Persephone, who is the daughter of Demeter. And he says, go ahead and take her. She'll be fine. She'll be a fine match for you. And so Hades goes, and while Persephone is bathing, he just kind of scoops her up and grabs her and pulls her down to Hades. Demeter later comes back and says, hey, where's my daughter? And no one tells her what happened. And so she becomes really distraught, really angry, upset. And then she decides to go to Earth, disguised as an old maid. And as on her way, like kind of walking between towns, she stumbles upon a woman with a baby, and the woman says, hey, why don't you come back to my palace, she's a queen, and help me raise my child. And so Demeter does, and she falls in love with the child as a mother, kind of motherly love with the child, and she wants to give the child a gift. And the gift that she's going to give to this child is the gift of immortality. And the way that the gods or goddesses do that is they dip a mortal in what is known as an eternal flame. And unfortunately, the mother wakes up in the middle of the night and sees the nursemaid dipping her baby into a flame, and she freaks out. And she becomes really angry, and she says, what are you doing? How dare you? Why are you trying to kill my baby? And Demeter is offended that a mortal would talk to her that way. And so she throws off her disguise as the old woman, reveals herself as a goddess, and says, you mortals are so short-sighted. And then she's angry. We would call this in psychology displacement, where she's really angry about her own daughter being abducted, but she takes her anger on the mortals. And Demeter is the goddess of agriculture. And so she curses the land, and so there is a famine upon the land, and humanity is on the brink of extinction. And what happens is eventually Zeus finds out about this and says, hey, there's a famine, and why is there a famine? And someone tells them it was Demeter, so he says, hey, Demeter, what's going on? And Demeter says, hey, I am really angry about my daughter. Where did she go? And Zeus says, oh, yeah. By the way, about our daughter, I probably should have ran this by you. He tells her that Persephone is down in Hades, and Demeter says, bring her back. And as he sends Hermes down to Hades to get Persephone back, Hades gives Persephone some ambrosia, and she eats down there. And because she eats down in Hades, now she has to go down to Hades for 3 months of the year. This is kind of like a joint custody, 3 months of the year, and then she gets to go and live with her mom for 9 months of the year. And so this is the Greek explanation for the seasons. For 3 months of the year, we're going to have famine or winter, and then for 9 months of the year, we can have growth. And so Bernini is representing this. And so here you see Hades with his crown as the king of the underworld, all of the delicate curls that we see on his beard. Just want to show you a couple of close-ups. You have to remember that this is carved within stone, right? And so as he picks her up violently and presses into her thigh, we can see those marks, those indentations, or as he violently picks her up around her abdomen, right? We can see his hands like grabbing into her as though it's like realistic. And so it's very interesting how he represents this. And then we see her pushing away, right? Kind of pushing away, trying to get away. She's fleeing, and the little tear from her eye being abducted. So again, it's focusing mainly on the climax of the story. The climax of the story here is her being abducted, and that violent act, the violent act of a very powerful masculine character, not really considering or caring for what's actually happening or the consequences of what's happening, as he selfishly then abducts this young woman down to his evil lair. I wanted to take a look at Baroque painting as well. Caravaggio is one of the most, if not the most, influential figures of the Baroque era, influencing artists throughout Europe, but especially in the Netherlands, who adopt his style. Caravaggio's style is simplicity with intense emotion. He often foreshortens the background, as we see here with the calling of St. Matthew, so we don't necessarily see a lot of that linear depth. There is depth to it, but it's not as though there's a lot of depth behind it. He always foreshortens it in one way or another. Here it's by the wall. His works are more like a snapshot of the moment that he depicts. The figures are staged differently. Sometimes the action is not at the center of the canvas, but off to one side, as we see here, right? Christ enters the room. And it's kind of interesting as he depicts this realistic, this spiritual moment realistically. Christ is kind of off, kind of pushed to the right-hand side as he raises his hand and points to Matthew, right, who is the tax collector. And so he then puts the halo, right, but he doesn't do like the medieval halo over his head. He just kind of puts his slight scratch on the back of the wall that gives it kind of the subtle, it's a halo, but also it looks realistic, like it could just be a marking on the wall. And he juxtaposes this with the light and the dark, the extreme light and the extreme dark, to create that dramatic, that dynamic that moment or intensity, right? This is the biblical story when Jesus goes to Levi, who will later be called St. Matthew, to call him to be a disciple. Jesus is dressed here in biblical garb or clothing, but St. Matthew and those at the table are wearing clothes of the 16th to 17th century. This is to allow the viewer to identify with these individuals, to think about what are we doing with our call, right? Additionally, Jesus is awkwardly, as I mentioned, off to the right rather than taking center stage, which is quite interesting. As I mentioned, the lighting is natural. This is a dark tavern, so there would not be much light in here. And this is very different from the Renaissance, which gives the works a timeless feel through very bright lighting. Christ is not well lit. Only his face and hands have lighting to indicate the most important, to draw our attention to the most important elements. Notice the emotion, right? The focus is on St. Matthew, who it could be either this individual here who's pointing to himself, or it could be this individual here who is counting his money for the last time, right? So there's a little bit of debate in the art world about which one is St. Matthew, right? So is it the person, the tax collector, that's kind of has his head down in the worldly kind of interests before he then leaves them for the spiritual interests? Or is it this individual here who is kind of questioning whether it's truly him, right? Is it really me? This is a limited, intimate space that we can, as the viewer, identify with, right? These very natural kind of feelings, these very natural emotions. And it captures an instant, causing us to realize what we would do, right, if caught off guard and called to a higher calling at any moment, that we must prepare. Again, it captures the climax of the moment when Christ extends the call, and now the choice has to be made. The humility, the hesitation, there's uncertainty of how he or us will respond. And it gets us to think about what would we do, right, if we were called by Christ within this context. A couple other images that I just wanted to show you of Caravaggio, which are quite common to him. This one is the Bacchus, which Bacchus is the god of wine, and here we have Bacchus surrounded by fruit, which is where wine comes from, and also having the wine glass as though he's offering it to us, right? So he foreshortens the background, right? That makes the center stage, and so we can't necessarily see beyond him. That draws our attention into the canvas. It makes us feel, the audience feels as though we're a participant within it, and it's as though Bacchus is inviting us to partake. And the question then is, what are we going to do, right? Are we going to go and enjoy this kind of frivolous lifestyle of folly, or are we going to stay true to our principles and abstain, right? And so the question is always put on us, the viewer, and this is going to be something that's extremely influential within the North. They're going to take Caravaggio's ideas, they're going to take his style, and they're going to apply it to their world. Or this one, right? Caravaggio Caravaggio's boy with a basket of fruit. Very similar idea, very similar image. It's almost as though they could be the same person that he's representing. But again, this is the idea of drawing us into this particular image. Here, he's not necessarily offering us any wine, but what we see here with the emphasis of the fruit is on how temporary life is, right? Generally, when we see fruit or flowers, it gives us the sense that life is fleeting, that it's temporary, that it's not going to last forever. And so the question is, what are we going to do with the time that we have? Are we going to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? Or are we going to be more kind of using the time to our fullest and be like that, St. Matthew, and leave our worldly possessions and focus on following Christ? But what we see within this, Caravaggio was an Italian painter. His actual first name is Michelangelo Caravaggio, but we don't call him Michelangelo because that would get confusing, so we just call him Caravaggio. But he's an Italian painter, and what we see with the painting of the 1600s and beyond is that we start to see a transition away from those overt Catholic messages and more of the influence of the North, of focusing more on kind of day-to-day events and getting us to think about it. And so he's using those ideas, and he's developing his own style, and then the North is going to take that style and then move northward with it. Or this one is Salome with the head of John the Baptist. And so here she dances for Herod because she's angry because John the Baptist was, I think he rejected her advances or something like that. And she becomes angry, wants vengeance, and so she dances before Herod, and Herod becomes enticed, and he says, well, come and spend some time with me. I don't know if those were exact words, but and she says, okay, I will, but you have to grant me one favor. And he says, I'll grant you anything. And she says, bring me the head of John the Baptist. And so what we see here is, again, this idea of folly, right? The idea of putting worldly possessions in front of our spiritual desires, right? And what generally happens with that. But again, we see the symbol or the stylistic foreshortening in the background. We see the use of the lighting to direct our attention on Herod, or at least Herod's servant here, who's bringing the head of John the Baptist in. We see it on Salome, and we see it on Salome's mother in the background, making sure that it happens. And then this is just the last one of Caravaggio that I wanted to show you before I show you how his style influences everything that comes after it with the Baroque era. This is his rendition of David. What we see here, very different from that we see with Bernini, very different from what we see with Michelangelo or Donatello. Here we see a young boy taking the actual head in his hand, the blood dripping down, and kind of quietly reflecting on what he has done and what he was able to do. And the lighting, again, kind of makes this dramatic kind of feel to it. And it just draws us in, and it gets us to kind of think about the intensity of this particular moment. Painting the climax of the story when he picks up the head and he frees Israel from the Philistines. And so focusing on the dynamic motion of the head being drawn up, the blood coming down, and the sword being cast to the side. I want to take a look at a female painter, if you can imagine that, Gentileschi. Gentileschi worked with her father in his shop and learned his style. Interestingly, women during this time, for the most part, were not allowed to enter art schools. And this was mainly because of studying nudes. It was thought that women would swoon at the sight of a nude or faint or something like that. But the idea was to keep women pure and their thoughts pure. And so this caused the number of women artists to be significantly reduced. However, the ones that are out there are impressive and they are noteworthy. And it's particularly interesting because we get to see through the eyes of a woman and see how she envisions this world, how she's responding to these events. Imagine leaving out the entire perspective of half of the population. You're going to miss so many insights. And so I wanted to take a look at some of her art. And here you can see this is her self-portrait as the allegory of painting. This is her kind of painting, her self-painting, which is an interesting kind of idea, right? The painter painting herself painting, which kind of gets us to think about, the idea of illusion and reality just a little bit. But you can see the style of Caravaggio. You can see the ideas that he establishes start to influence with the foreshortened background. Because the light is not quite as dark as intense as we see with other Caravaggio works, and we'll see with other Gentileschi works. But we can see that it has a little bit of that darkness off to the right-hand side, and a little bit on her face, and then some things are very brightly lit, like her hand, right, focusing on the act of art, and then on her facial expressions. I wanted to juxtapose two images, and I want you to think about which one you like better. And I think that this is a good juxtaposition to get us to think about. One is done by Caravaggio, one is done by Gentileschi, and I want you to think about which one was the woman and which one was the male representation, right? Just to give you a sense of what's going on, what's the content of this particular image. This comes from the Apocrypha, which are writings that are coming out of ancient Israel that didn't make the cut for becoming quote-unquote canonized or scripture. And what we have within the book of Judith is that Holofernes is an invading general, and he's threatening to overtake all of Israel. All of Israel believe that they're going to be subject to bondage, and so they're afraid. But one person, Judith, wants to free her people, and she gets herself ready. She makes herself look nice and pretty. She goes over to Holofernes' camp, and she seduces him. She gets him drunk, and then while he is in a kind of a drunken moment, she cuts off his head and takes it back to camp. And then the Holofernes' army is without a leader and disorganized, and they eventually have to abandon their plans to take over Israel. And so these are the moments this is the moment that these two artists are representing, right? So here you see Judith and Holofernes, and him getting his head cut off, and his expression on his face, and as if to say, "Hey, what's going on?" And then over here you see an older woman, which the older woman within art is a motif. It's just an indicator of an exchange. Generally, a procuress. That's what the old woman generally represents. A procuress is a person that negotiates a date with a woman, let's say that, in negotiation for or in return for a nominal fee. And so the procuress here is just to insert iconography to let you know that there was a date that happened in this particular moment. And so you'll see that again and again. And so over here on the other hand side, we see a similar kind of idea with kind of an elderly or an older woman here helping, and then Judith here, who is just kind of cutting off the head and kind of in the act. Both of them are representing the climax of the story. Both of them have that foreshortened background due to either this curtain here or just the darkness of night. Both of them have an extreme contrast of light and dark, directing our attention on what to focus on. I want you to think about which one handles it better, which one feels more realistic to you, and why, right? Tradition has it that men generally dominate the art museums to almost a 9-to-1 ratio. And generally what is argued is that women are left out of art museums because they're just not as good. And I want you to think about that. I want you to think about it, whether that's true or that's just part of the social construct that they push on us, right? As we think about these two works, is there one that's clearly better than the other, or are they both good? Where are your thoughts with that? And we'll take a look at this more with the Zoom for this week. Taking a look at a couple of other Artissima Gentileschi's works, I just wanted to show you a couple more. She kind of returns to this theme again and again, which is an interesting representation, right? Which is an interesting thought that she keeps going back to this particular story, that Judith is something important for her as a woman to continue to represent. So we have to think about, what is it about Judith that she found so valuable? Here we see Judith with the sword in her hand, and again another elderly lady, and then the head inside the basket, and they kind of turn to look off as if to say, were we followed? Did they hear us? they're returning to save her people. And as we think about this, right, what is the representation of womanhood that's being celebrated here? Judith as a hero of her people, Judith as someone that has value, that has strength, that it's not just about, physical strength, but it's also about her intellectual strength is something that could be celebrated, that Gentileschi continues to return to. And so the climax of this story, rather than, the lopping off the head, the climax of this story is as they turn to look, can they get away with it, right? Are they home free or are they not? And again, she turns to it again and again, right? So we have to think about, she really identified with this particular image, this particular message, that women can have a role, a more important role in society than they're currently given in the 17th century. And so here, different moments, they're kind of getting ready to put the head in the basket. The deed is already done. And she kind of puts her hand up to the candle my mouse is going crazy, to kind of look off to see if someone heard, right? So again, focusing on that foreshortened background, that darkness, that creates that intensity, and then the light that directs our attention. But again, thinking about what is being represented here. I wanted to leave off our discussion of Artesia Gentileschi by taking a look at Susanna and the elders. And what happens here within this particular painting is that two elderly men spy on a young woman named Susanna. Susanna went out in her garden one day for a bath while her housekeeper let these two elderly gentlemen in. The elders spied on her and demanded things of her that she was not willing to do. They threatened to ruin her reputation, but she still refused. And so the two elders falsely accused her of committing adultery until the young wise man named Daniel intervened. And he knows the two elder stories did not match up. And so Daniel questioned them separately, and their mismatching stories revealed the falsehood of their testimony, clearing Susanna's name and declaring her to be innocent. But again, Artesia takes a look at this image, or takes a look at this story, and represents it in a very unique way that offers some interesting insights into how she's seen womanhood and how she's seen their relationship with men and how men might abuse their power. This could be considered one of the first Me Too movement paintings, where we see the problems that people use power and abuse their power to gain more advantage over women to do things that they're not willing to do. And so an interesting representation. I think it's important to keep in mind, important to think about, because we're going to see representations of womanhood differently by men. And I wanted to take a look at Honthorst the Procuress. And we've talked about the Procuress before when we've examined Judith and Holofernes. Procuress is the elderly woman who is negotiating an exchange for the favors of a young woman. And so here we see this young gentleman here coming in and he has his money in his hand, and the woman here is directing her to the young lady, who is playing a lute. Generally in the North, they equated wine and music to folly, and so she's playing music, kind of like a siren, luring this particular person in to his divine. But again, what we see as Honthorst is a Dutch painter who studied in Rome, he was heavily influenced by Caravaggio, and he brought these ideas back with him after he studied in Rome. Here we see that there's no overt Christian message, as Lutherans and Calvinists reject that Catholic Church's emphasis on religious art. Thus, their art does not depict, as I mentioned, saints, or it mainly focuses on secular images. However, the works still have a religious message to them. Here, a young man tries to gain the favors of a young lady, right? And in so doing, he's falling to his own folly. The argument is that we need to constantly guard ourselves against vices, or we might fall into the trap and the sin of this young man. But notice how stylistically this looks just like a Caravaggio painting, right? The foreshortened background of the wall, the sense that the lighting is dramatic, there's a sense of it being on stage, it directs our attention. We see the climax of the story of the moment before his fall. Let's take a look at Rembrandt. Rembrandt's part of this era as well, part of the Baroque era, influenced by Caravaggio's image. Probably the most important artist of the Baroque era was Rembrandt, right? So I would say in Italy, the most important artist would be Caravaggio. In the north, it would be Rembrandt. He did over 600 paintings, 300 etchings, and over 1,400 drawings. And 90 of these were self-portraits. Let's take a look at Bathsheba. This depicts the moment where David arose from his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from that he saw a woman washing herself. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon, and here I'm kind of quoting some of the scripture that it comes from. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, "Is that not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness. And she returned unto her house, and the woman conceived, and sent and told David, and he said, I am with child. And David sent unto Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David, and when Uriah was come up unto him, David demanded him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. And so what is being represented here is the moment that Bathsheba received the letter from David in her hand as she's bathing to come and to be with him. And now she is lost deep in thought, thinking about what she should do. Should she go and be with a king, or should she remain loyal to her husband? And this is a difficult decision, because she can either be loyal to the king or she be loyal to her husband. And she's caught in between. And so the scriptures mentioned how she was purified from this uncleanness. But what we see here, very similar to the ideas of the Epicurus, very similar ideas to Bacchus, the idea that we have to guard ourselves against sin. And so here we have David, who defeated Goliath, the leader of the people, bringing modern, kind of more of a modernized way of doing things to Israel. Known for his leadership, known for his strength and stability, known for his faith, but even he falls into folly, and so this becomes the moment where he steps away and makes some pretty big mistakes. And I like this quote by Martin Luther. It kind of captures some of the ideas. We first approach the subject of the inward man, that we may see by what means a man becomes justified, free, and a true Christian. So focuses on ourselves, that inward self. It is certain that absolutely none among outward things, under whatever name they may be reckoned, has any influence in producing Christian righteousness or liberty, nor any other hand unrighteousness or slavery. And so he says that it's mainly about us and what we do. It's not necessarily about whether we're king. It's not necessarily about whether we defeated a Goliath or giant in our lives. It's about what we do on a day-to-day basis. And so the Baroque art is going to constantly see this. And so even though this is a biblical image, the representation here is it has a very contemporary feel to it. And that's going to be common within Baroque art. And as Martin Luther mentions, right, it's all about the inward man. And so Rembrandt spends a majority of his paintings, or a large number, I shouldn't say the majority, but a large number of his paintings on painting himself, because it is about the inward man. And so what we see here is that it's not necessarily representing the power of women and how they can lead men to their demise, as we've seen with the Epicurus, or as we see with Bathsheba. This is mainly about him. But this, even though it's a self-portrait, it still has those undercurrents of religion, right? And so we can see that it's mainly about that self-introspection. It's about mysticism. It's about this idea of our relationship with God and no one else, right? No one else is going to, intervene in our behalf between our relationship with us and Christ. It's not as though it's about, the Pope or anything. It's about us, right? And so he sets himself as the center of importance, constantly being inward, introspective about where he is in his relationship to God. And it's interesting how he represents himself, always kind of half in the shadow and half in light. Very similar to the style that we see with Caravaggio, with a foreshortened background, and the chiaroscuro, or tenebrism, as it's often known as well. the light and dark contrast. But it's mainly about, not only it's about him investigating himself, but it's about us now investigating ourselves. It's interesting how he represents himself, though, too, because he never, represents himself as idealized as we see with the Renaissance. He's represented himself with all his vices, with all his problems, because really that's what's important. It's important to see ourselves as we really are. It's important to see truth. It's not important to see idealism or try to gloss over that. It's important to know all of our flaws so that we can work each day to improve them. And that's going to be a constant message that we see in the North and within Northern art. And so we see him here, kind of a younger Rembrandt here, kind of half in the shadow, kind of have that duality of the part of him is in light and part of him is dark. He has that conflict within. This one is more of a kind of a humorous image of himself as he draws himself, draws his image, or this one as he constantly goes back and thinks about how he is. But this is, again, another quote from Martin Luther. He says, "Scripture makes no distinction between clergy and laymen, except that those who are now boastfully called popes, bishops, lords, it calls ministers, servants, and stewards, who are now to serve the rest of the ministering world." And so what we see within this is it's not necessarily about what you wear, it's about who you are on the inside. And so he takes that idea of Martin Luther, and then the Baroque era just runs with that notion. It's about the inward man. It's not about what we wear or what position we gain in life. It's about what we do and what's on the inside. And so we see him constantly looking deeper and deeper into himself, half in the shadow and half amongst the light. And so, but again, he returns himself throughout his life. Very similar to what we see with Michelangelo as he's investigating himself, kind of sees himself and worried about his eternal salvation. What we see with Rembrandt is these are the kind of the catharsis for him to work his way through that, to think about where he is in these kind of early versions of selfies, to constantly think about his own introspection. I kind of joke about these being selfies because selfies are mainly about, putting ourselves in kind of superficially and wherever we are to kind of show off where we are. These are quite different than that because, this is about really understanding who am I and what am I really doing. So there's a much more depth, much more introspection involved within them. And again, not necessarily, painting himself idealized. Here we see a red nose, the gray hair, and all the wrinkles. But again and again, coming closer and closer. And we see some of the expressive brushstrokes that he kind of thickly applies to the canvas to give that sense of wrinkles, to give that sense of depth to the painting, the texture to the painting, to give it more of a richness and a deeper complexity. I wanted to just, as we conclude today, I just want to take a look at a couple more Baroque artists that stand out. This one is Vermeer. Vermeer was a Dutch genre painter who lived and worked in Delft and created some of the most exquisite paintings in Western art. And what we see within the Baroque era is the heavy influence of the Dutch merchants, very similar to what we see happening in Florence during the 14 and 1500s. But instead, what's happening differently in the Netherlands is that we see, rather than focusing on directing their attention towards the church and ancient ideas, we see them wanting to focus more on contemporary themes of the day, things of the day, things that are about the average business kind of person and the affairs of that are going to be most important to them. And so what we see with Baroque images is more of the common day-to-day life of what the workers would have been doing. Vermeer's works are very rare. Of the 35 or 36 paintings generally attributed to him, most of them portray figures in interiors and indoors. All of his works are admired for their sensitivity, which he rendered the effects of light and color, and for their poetic quality of the images. Little is known about his life and career. Not much is known about his apprenticeship as an artist either. But what we see here with the lace makers, the virtues of work, industry, and sobriety as religious virtues that are going to be dominant within Protestants, can be dominant within Calvinist ideas. The lace maker here keeps to herself, and he keeps herself busy in needlework. Idle hands are the devil's play toy, so the saying goes. So to keep oneself out of trouble, you should be busy, because sloth is a particular sin. And so here we see a woman, another representation of women. So that's kind of an interesting subtopic that we've been examining today. Women that have some power and independence and intellect versus women who have some type of demonic abilities, the woman as the destroyer that are luring men to their death, or women that are just kind of off in work. And so something to perhaps think about, what we'll do with our discussion board, is think about this representation of womanhood, and what do we do with it? How do we respond to this representation? This one's just kind of an interesting one, because I was surprised as I went to this one. This is currently in the Louvre. I was surprised by how small it is, and so you can get a sense of the extreme size and extreme smallness of the size to see how close that brushwork really had to be in order to create such fine detail within that particular image. Or we see here the milkmaid, always representing people in indoor settings that are busily going about their day, keeping busy. And the idea is that if we keep busy, then we can maintain that righteous path. We can stay on that godly ascent that we need to focus on. That we need to transcend the daily events to be able to become more divine. And so, even though again these aren't necessarily overtly biblical settings or messages, the undercurrent of the message is very similar. But I love in this one how it's capturing the milk as it's pouring out of the glass, capturing the kind of the drops, but also capturing the light coming from the window and casting on her face. And so it really captures just the era. It gives us a kind of a window in to experience what she experiences. And this one's probably his most famous work, The Girl with a Pearl Earring, and representing again this idea of women and their value and their importance. And the question is, what is the argument that they're making? Why are women important? Why are they centrally the focus of Vermeer and his art? And here she could either be turning to us or turning away from the audience. But again, similar manner to Caravaggio, darkens the background, focuses the lighting to direct our attention, to invite us in. And I mean, as we think about this, is this a representation that's similar to Hawthorne's Procuress, where there's a young woman that's leading men to their doom, or is this more of a representation of the Judith and Holofernes, the power of women, or is this more of just kind of the day-to-day women? Something to think about as we go forward. And then just to kind of leave off here with a couple of last images that show the importance of industry, thrift, and sobriety, and how we need to constantly guard ourselves. And these Puritan ideals are going to be taken from Europe and transplanted deeply within the United States and the United States culture. Here we see the idle servant, and so the idea of class here, we have a wealthy woman who's hired this young servant girl, but of course she has taken her day to sleeping and not picking up after herself, and so the whole kitchen is gone to mess, and even the cat is going up on the counter and wreaking havoc. And the woman here kind of points to her and says, "Yeah, this is what happens when you're not careful, if you're not guarding yourself." But it also captures that idea that Adam Smith suggests, that the real poverty of the poor is the failure to capture the vision of what their potential is. And that this kind of becomes, I mean, that of course is an oversimplification, but it does capture the mindset of where these guys were coming from as they're representing these values of work, industry, sobriety. And if you are poor, it's because you have chosen to be poor, and it's because you lack the vision to become something better. So again, it's showing that idea of that mobility. If you take the opportunities given to you, or this one, the linen cupboard. Here we have the master of the home helping to clean it, helping to take care of things, and making sure that everything is nice and neat. The argument here is that a clean home is a godly home. And so you want to make sure that your house is in order. So again, the values of religion are deeply embedded within the works, even though there's no overt iconography that would be able to identify. And so most people just take a look at this and say, okay, this is interesting. It's just a guy putting some linens away in an armoire. But really, there is deeper ideas that are happening. And what I love about this one is that you can kind of see with the perspective, you get a little bit more sense of the background, which was a little bit unique for the Baroque era. But you can see all the way through. Sorry, mouse is going crazy. You can see it through this other room and then all the way out the door into this real contemporary setting. And so really you see that the values of the working class, the merchants, what they value. You can see their religious ideas and what they value. So you can see a lot of ideas coming together as we peer into the window into their world through art.